So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Negotiation Options in Haiti webinar, which has been organized by the Institute for Integrated Transitions with the generous support of the Karsh Institute for Democracy of the University of Virginia. My name is Maria Jose Daza, and I am a research associate at the Institute for Integrated Transitions, an international think tank dedicated to bridging the gap between theory and practice in the fields of negotiation and transitions. I am delighted to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished panelists, Mark Freeman, Marta Maya, Professor Robert Fatton, and Dr. François Pierre-Louis, and our moderator, Laurent Dubois. We hope the collective wisdom and experience of our panelists enrich our understanding of the challenges and opportunities inherent in engaging with criminal actors and gang violence in the context of Haiti. So without further ado, I now pass the floor to Laurent, who will guide us through today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you all for joining us here today. I'm really honored to be able to help moderate this conversation and shape this conversation. We're all very concerned about and trying to think about the possibilities for future transitions in Haiti. We'll be hearing today from two specialists who worked globally on questions of kind of amnesty and negotiation, Mark Freeman, the director at the Institute, and who is the author of a global study on negotiating with criminal groups and an expert on this as a global challenge. Marta Maya, who has worked as a leader in negotiations in the Colombian context, which could potentially give us lessons and approaches. And then two major specialists of the Haitian political situation and its history, Robert Fatton, my own colleague here at the University of Virginia, the author of many studies of the state and society in Haiti, and François Pierre-Louis, eminent scholar who is the chair of political science at CUNY Queens, and they will help us think through the Haitian context. So I did want to ask you first, Mark, if you can help us sort of situate the conversation and help us think about how the kinds of approaches that are taken to this question that Haiti is facing today. What are some lessons, examples, guidelines that you might recommend based on your study of these global trends?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Laurent. Well, the first thing to say maybe is that this is a taboo subject. The idea of negotiating with criminal groups is sort of anathema to most actors, anathema ethically, anathema politically. When we think about negotiation, we can imagine negotiating, and we frequently negotiate as a global community or as local communities with politically motivated groups, rebels, guerrilla, and so forth. But when you change the group to gangs, cartels, pirates, mafia, the idea of negotiating with these groups is really a taboo. And at the same time, I mean, from our global study of the subject, it's clear that negotiations with criminal groups happen all the time. They happen all the time. They happen locally, nationally, even internationally. They're done in secret in many cases. They often are oriented towards short-term partial agreements. They're more transactional generally in nature, but they happen all the time. And in most cases, from our global study, it seems, most cases they happen out of some kind of need. The criminal groups are causing problems, in some cases extreme problems, as we can see in Haiti today from the headlines, and become major power brokers in a particular environment. And negotiation sometimes is a necessary evil, let's put it like that. So that's a little bit in terms of context setting. There are lots of different lessons that we cover in our study that come out of 25 cases. We only examined cases where the motivation for negotiation on the part of the non-criminal actors, which in some cases were governments, in some cases were might have been a church, a lawyer, a community, a police officer. We only looked at cases where the motivation was toward reducing or eliminating the criminal violence. So we didn't look at cases of collusion, which of course is very common. There's lots of negotiation that takes place with criminal groups that is collusive in its orientation. But we didn't study those because we were interested in learning from cases where there was a good faith orientation towards violence reduction. We expected to find 25, when we eventually identified these 25 cases, which was very difficult because, as I said, a lot of these negotiations are covert or denied. But in the cases, we expected to just learn about 25 cases of failure. And we didn't, to our own surprise, we found something very different. We found some surprising but limited successes, sometimes short-term successes, midterm successes. And the agreements took different forms. Sometimes it might be for a local ceasefire. Sometimes it might be for a form of legalization of some portion of the group's activity. There was a mix of different kinds of outcomes depending on the goals of that particular negotiation. But legal leniency was certainly a core ingredient in all the cases that we looked at. Some form of legal leniency. If we, the criminal group, are to make concessions, one part of the demands from their side was some form of legal leniency. It may be an amnesty. In some cases, it might be better prison conditions. There were negotiations that took place from within jails in some cases. But some form of legal leniency, a ban on extradition in some cases was relevant. So some form of legal leniency seems to be very pertinent. But I would say just, to not say too much maybe at the outset, maybe just one critical point that came through very strongly in this study was the importance of having a strategy, having a vision about and a sort of direction of travel to why whoever you are negotiating with those criminal groups. And again, it was not always, don't always assume a government. It can be other actors who are either designated by or acting independently of some government or public institution because of need on some basis, or in some cases, opportunity. But when there was a strategy, the results were generally better. When there was methodology, the results were generally better. When there was a strategic vision, in short, and preparation to go with it. When those elements were present, the results were generally much better. When the effort was more ad hoc, when there was less methodological rigor, as you could probably expect, that the level of success was generally lower. I'll leave it there for now, but those are maybe a few elements to share.
Thank you, Mark. I think those questions of methodology, maybe we'll get back to more as specifications. And so Martha, would you like to add something to the general picture and also give us perhaps some of your sense of how the Colombian example might offer some pathways or examples?
Thank you so much, Laurent. Well, indeed, the idea of negotiating with criminal groups is not new in Colombia at all. And the lessons from Colombia were examined as part of this research that Mark was pointing at. Since 1980s, I would say Colombia has been conducting different types of negotiation with armed groups, mainly guerrillas with a rebel political nature, but then in the 1990s, the approach to dialogue and negotiation had to extend to paramilitaries and organized crime groups. And there have been multiple types of results. It would be hard to say it's a success or not, but these experiences, they do include agreements like truces, ceasefires, crime or homicide reduction, humanitarian arrangements, and they go all the way to individual or collective submission to justice or effective demobilization, disarmament, and reincorporation of the armed group members. So I would start highlighting two initial findings for the conversation in which we can use the example of Colombia as an idea for lessons. So one is the need for some sort of legal framework, which works in two ways. It allows those who negotiate to approach to dialogue, to physically meet with the armed group members with a greater level of legal certainty, I would say. But they also mark the field, having a legal framework marks the field and the limits in which the group members could be offered legal leniencies, like what Mark Freeman was explaining, in exchange to different commitments. There are, in all the cases, and there have been in Colombia, more informal dialogues and approaches, which usually take place between sectors of society and the groups. And what happens is those approaches can facilitate, can create the conditions and allow for the dialogues to happen. But from the experience of Colombia, what we have seen is that it is only with a proper legal framework that the agreements become solid and enforceable enough. That would be the first finding I would like to highlight. And a second one is the idea of identifying incentives and credible threats for that conversation, that negotiation, that dialogue to take place, where we in Colombia, we have even learned from our own experience, because usually we think that those incentives and credible threats can only come from the state authorities, and they usually come from the state authorities. But one of the things we have seen is that they also come from external facts, threats from other sources of violence, threats from illicit economies, crisis, that would be threats or incentives or opportunities, but also from families or young group demands to cease violence that become important within the community. And also, I mean, new business, politics, or employment opportunities. So having the capacity as part of that strategy and vision that Mark Freeman was highlighting, of thinking about those incentives and those credible threats beyond just what a state authority can create, has been important for us as well in Colombia. Things have changed, our context has changed, and we have new challenges, but I would leave that for another question, Laurent, and I will leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you. So it sounds like you've outlined, and I think this is probably what you're referring to, Mark, in terms of methodology, the legal framework. I guess there's questions about, who sets those legal frameworks, on what terms, et cetera, right? And what institutions can then enforce them or credibly enforce them. Is there any other piece of the methodology that maybe we should put also on the table, or anything else that we're missing before I turn to our Haiti specialists, or is anything else that you'd want me to address there? Or?
I mean, I'm happy to have you come back to us if you'd like, once we hear from Robert and Francois, their reactions, and if we could have an opportunity to react after that, we could definitely bring in a couple more examples. But thank you.
Examples. Fantastic. Okay. Well, I'm now going to turn to you. Maybe I'll start with you, Francois, if that's okay, to give some initial thoughts and reactions about how these frameworks or how this process could potentially unfold in Haiti, obstacles, possibilities.
Thank you, Laurent. I listened attentively to the methodology and the situation in Colombia. As an example, I'm looking at the state of Haiti, which has totally collapsed, with no institutions, and within those institutions that existed were corrupt to the core, where you couldn't really have either the judicial system, the legal system did not work, the presidential system, prime minister system did not work. So therefore, who do you approach to establish this when there's real people that are dealing with the gangs are also involved? For example, the police, almost half or 2/3 of the police is involved with the gangs, and collusion with the gangs. So therefore, I think that's one of the weaknesses of the case of Haiti, lack of institutional support. In 2006, when I was in the cabinet of Jacques-Edouard Alexis and President Préval, they had a method to deal with the gangs at that time. And the method was, first they created an agency to work with the gangs, and then they began to have a series of social programs. The plan was, you negotiate, you provide some incentives, and you disarm, and then those that were hardened criminals that you couldn't do anything with, those were the ones that they would be trying to go to jail, or if they're, and there would be violence, whatever happens, but they wanted to make sure that they couldn't have any impact. At that time, that program worked for a while. Many of the gang members, especially the young people who joined the gangs because they had no other alternatives, they were offered training, they were given money to start small businesses, and also they were given amnesty. If they did not commit atrocities and crimes that that could not be given amnesty for. When Mateli came in, even though he said he believed in that program, wanted to continue it, in fact, it became a shell of itself. He did not fund it. Michel Mateli was the president after Préval came. He was in collusion with the gangs. And most of the weapons that the gang got came from his administration. There were shipments of weapons from the Israeli government for the Haitian government. And those guns ended up in the hands of the gang leaders and the gangs that the government supported because they wanted to use these gangs to win the elections. And the chief of police who was there wanted to stop the shipment of the gangs to the police, to the gangs, was fired because he was not in agreement with this administration. So therefore, I think you need really institutional support. And at the same time, you need, one of the things I think that happened in Colombia, you had international support also to go toward that process. Whereas in Haiti, what has happened recently with the gangs, it was the US ambassador who supported the Federation of the Gangs, thinking maybe that would have been a process to tame the gangs and to negotiate with them. Instead of the gangs willing to negotiate, they become more emboldened and more willing to attack the population. And then when Ariel came recently, when the gangs began to attack, he kept silent. He never really took any position against the gangs. So therefore, the population itself saw that as supporting the gangs by the state, instead of being the state being protecting them. And this really complicated the situation in terms of how do you negotiate with the gangs. And the third thing I would like to add to that is that compared to the situation I just mentioned in Colombia, you had an organized structure within the gangs, I think. Probably you have discipline, you have a clear leadership, and you have a command, that hierarchy. Whereas in Haiti, I don't think that happens. I think what you really have is that you have gang leaders that are in different communities, even though it looks like they talk to each other, but they're all little chieftains. They're all little bosses. And I don't think there's a hierarchy of order that you can give an order and then you follow through. But I do agree that the whole idea of it's a question of transactional, because the way they negotiate with their gangs, even the government, for example, Barbecue, which is one of the reputed gang leaders, control the oil, the port for the oil delivery. Whenever they wanted the oil to come in, they would negotiate with him, give him some money, then the delivery will happen. The minute that money is over, then he would stop it again. So therefore, he realizes that the government needed them to deal with this without any hoping that the government would take any sanctions against them. So therefore, I think that collusion between the government and the gangs makes it much more difficult to negotiate a comprehensive plan with the gangs. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. So one of the things I'm hearing, I think, is the obviously the problem of institutions or lack of institutions that might be available in other places. Also, the sort of very structure of the gangs might be different in other places. I was struck, Martha, you mentioned that one of the points of pressure might be from community demands themselves. And it sounds like the program you described earlier being involved with, François, was one in which essentially there was a kind of change of what the community felt because opportunities were given, and sort of some of the undergirding support for the gang might change in that context. I just wanted to flag that because it does seem like that seems like an important thing to keep in mind in this case when there's such an absence of other forces at work. So Robert, I might turn to you and see if you have things to add or other things we need to think about in this conversation.
Yes, I totally agree with Francois. We have a situation where you have a complete void of authority. You don't really have a state. So at this very moment, it's difficult to see how and whom would negotiate with the gangs. I think we need to have, in the first place, the institutionalization of the current presidential council, which seems to be a very difficult process. And in fact, the presidential council may fail and may ultimately dissolve as things are going now. But the other consideration is the issue of dissuasion vis-à-vis the gangs. Because when Francois was talking about the government of Préval, you also had MINUSTA, which had 13,000 troops. In other words, there was a comprehensive force that was prepared and did, in fact, go into the slum in order to tame the violence of the gangs. We don't have that now. The best that we have is a very small, committed group of police officers and some members of the reconstituted army, which are really trying to contain the gangs. But we don't have a capacity to tell them, well, if you don't do that, you're going to be in trouble. And I think in all of those negotiations, you need some dissuasion issue, and you need some coercive power on the part of the state. That said, let's assume, for argument's sake, that the presidential council were to emerge and were capable, as it were, of creating the Truth Commission, creating better economy, etc. Then at that point, I think the Truth Commission might be a site where the issue of negotiation with the gangs might occur. Because as Mark has pointed out, negotiating with gangs is a taboo subject. Politicians don't like to do so openly, but they could use, for instance, a commission within the Truth Commission that might help in the negotiation problems and might also be delegated the powers to negotiate with the gangs in a similar fashion as it was done under Préval. So that, to me, is a possibility. But until you have a structure of state institutions that are functioning properly, and I'm not asking for a big deal, but that are functioning, you can't really enter into those kind of negotiations to resolve the problems. And in the long term, you need to address the issues of poverty, et cetera, that are besieging the areas where the gangs are created. And finally, and I think this is one critical factor, and this is the issue of collusion between state actors, private actors with the gangs. Now, the gangs may have acquired a certain degree of autonomy, but on the other hand, they also are part of that network of gangsterization that has characterized Haitian politics for some 15, 20, 30 years. And who's going to negotiate with them for what purposes is an interesting question. But the issue is whether the very state actors and private actors who nurtured the gangs in the first place, are they going to be prepared to say enough is enough? And this is a problem that may not have existed in Colombia, I don't know. But this is a critical issue, that you may have state actors and critical private actors who have a vested interest in continuing to nurture the gangs. And if that is the case, then the negotiations are going to be kind of a mirage. They're not going to be very real. So you need to have some sort, first, of dissuasion power on the part of the state. You need also a state that has some legal system, and we don't have one. Let's assume that you would say to the gangs, okay, you're going to have amnesty. who's going to guarantee that amnesty? And then, but some of you guys, you're so toxic that you need to go to jail. We no longer have jails. So you have a real problem of institutional decay that makes any type of negotiations extremely difficult, not impossible, because you could have a compromise, as it were. But this will take a lot of time, and it will also take the reconstitution of a semblance of a functioning state in Haiti.
Let me just put two things on the table, and then I'll ask Mark and Martha to respond. One is on your last point about collusion, right, and kind of the relationships that do exist. Are those possible points of, in other words, could those interests shift at a certain point, right? Are those what you're kind of describing as people who already basically work with the gangs, right, and in various ways. I'm curious if those actors might play a role, or if you think, they're kind of they're already on one path and they're going to stick to that path, or could their interests change? And the second is the question of the international role. Obviously, in the Haitian context, this tends to always revolve around the deployment of a force, right? Sort of MINUSTA or other forces. And my general reading of the international context is there's a kind of not much interest or willingness, serious willingness to do that again, right? So we have the Kenya option and so forth. But the idea of the deployment of a large military force back to Haiti is criticized from various angles. It seems not very, very realistically on the horizon. You should correct me if you think I'm wrong about that. But I am curious about the international relationship to the traffic of weapons itself, right? So in other words, the weaponry that undergirds the gangs do come from somewhere. They come from external sources. They're not made in Haiti. And I'm curious about that. If there are conversations about that, but that feels like a place where the international role might potentially, in terms of the supply question, could potentially exercise. So those are two things. So the international community as well as sort of particular actors internally. Mark and Martha, though, are there things that you'd like to react to from either that question or anything that was said about strategy and methodology?
Thank you, Laurent. I'll just share a few thoughts. I mean, I think we're all in agreement in this conversation about the need for dissuasion or credible threat. I think each of us mentioned that. I mean, there's no point negotiating unless you have negotiating power. You have no negotiating power if you have no credible threat. So that's a sine qua non. And so, but I would say that two things can happen at once. I mean, that has to be the first step, so to speak. But alongside that, once you've built up a minimum level of dissuasion, once there's a recalibration, which is hopefully what will happen for the Haitian people, a recalibration, rebalancing of power in terms of the monopoly of over violence. I mean, it's tilted to the opposite extreme of what anyone would want in a state or a society. But then the question is, now let's imagine a moment where there's an opportunity. There's been some recalibration. If you arrive at that moment, if you arrive unprepared at that moment, the lesson that we have from our cases is that that's an own goal, so to speak. You can prepare if you had even a minimally functioning and internationally supported government that maybe had a security council that was tasked with creating a security strategy. That can begin. You could even imagine appointing, as we've seen in some other cases, a security council sort of body, publicly appointing some non-partisan, non-governmental actors. It could be experts such as Robert and Francois, or church leaders, anyone who is trusted and credible, to begin to speak with all actors and start to think about these things and begin a consultation process. These are the kinds of methodological steps that can be taken in parallel. And I would say it's recommendable to take some of those steps in parallel. Start early, essentially, to think about these questions, because you also need to build social consensus. You need to build a legal framework, as Marta was saying as well. There's pieces that can be done while the critical first step of building dissuasion and credible threat takes place. And then the only other thing I suppose I would react to, I mean, I think I would also say you asked about the international role. I think that can be part of the international role is helping to seed some of these actions. Help support a technical working group on a security strategy, an early one. These are the kinds of things that can be very important when that moment arrives, sometimes unexpectedly. Criminal groups implode. They don't sound from the description in this conversation to be very structured or very cohesive necessarily. Everything is transactional. Alliances shift quickly, leaders get killed, all kinds of things can happen. Then the question is, well, is society and is the government or whatever institutions exist, is the international community ready with a vision about what you're going to do in case a window of opportunity arises? So it's a really critical piece. And if it turns out that there's just enough cohesion and just enough structure with what remains, and there has been a recalibration of power, there is some minimal level of dissuasion or credible threat, and you're ready, then negotiation could become a very important instrument. And indeed, I would say, looking at Haiti today, it's hard to imagine how it could even be avoided.
Thank you. Martha, any thoughts you'd like to share?
Yes, thank you, Laurent. And listening to François and Robert, I think I would like to go back to some ideas of the challenges that we have right now in Colombia, because indeed before we had fewer and more cohesive groups, as you were mentioning, François. So the approach to them was in a way easier, but today violence and crime are perpetrated by multiple armed groups. The context has changed with different dynamics, different levels of involvement in illegal and legal economies, and different types of participation in criminal activities. So we are forced in a way to think in a more tailor-made approach to the different situations, which we are building right now, and a more comprehensive response. And part of that has been how to address some of the questions that you both were saying in terms, the three of you were mentioning in terms of sequence, in terms of collusion, in terms of institutional decay, in terms of national support. And I would say that some of those, that criteria or those elements that we are studying right now, and probably they could be useful to think through in the case of Haiti. We have been thinking how to address the economic needs and the economic interests of the different kinds of members of the group, which go from very basic needs to thinking about tax amnesties or different things for those on the top, but also think collectively about their communities, the environment and the social dynamics where they operate, which in many cases, even in Colombia, the level of institutional decay is vast. Understand better or envision their possible role in society, thinking, for instance, on the level of development that you have to create on that society so that they have a role without ending up in the chicken and egg dilemma. Also analyzing who needs to take part in the conversations, thinking about this element of collusion. What do you have to talk to the different actors, or how do you approach the different actors that are involved in enabling or stopping these negotiations or this dialogue to happen? How to create a roadmap, a sequence, some sort of gradual process to address the justice elements, the victims, the truth element within the negotiation, even if there's very few capacity of enforcing prosecution and sanctions. So you can think through about that in a more gradual way. It does happen in some places of this country as well, but also to start, as Mark was saying, in a parallel way or simultaneously to draw a path, some sort of architecture for non-repetition, to think how do you create the conditions for those members of those groups not to end up very quickly doing the same. And I'm mentioning these elements because we have realized that now we have a bigger challenge. The elements we had before are not enough. And those are elements we are currently studying, but we haven't properly solved. But thanks.
Thanks. I'd love to turn back to Robert and Francois for some reactions. I wanted to bring up two questions I think are arising, right? Which is, or the question of kind of popular participation, right? Of what role that might be the Truth and Reconciliation. It might be the community members who sort of whose interests change or whose reaction changes. I do also want to, I think it's pretty clear there are also regional variations in Haiti. We tend to think primarily about Port-au-Prince, but the North and the South, I think, have had a different kind of trajectory with criminal groups and in some cases communities kind of mobilizing to prevent access in certain ways. So I wonder if that provides some opportunity. I think we all know as Haiti specialists that sometimes the focus exclusively on the central city blinds us to certain things or precludes certain kinds of conversations. So I wonder too if there's examples of how does one do this on a countrywide basis and maybe engage groups that are far from the capital and often a bit overlooked. So François, you want to go? Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because the other thing I was thinking of is the class. There's a class component in the sense that we don't talk too much about in Haiti. But if you can see, most of the gang leaders come from the working class or people that are want to move from the peasantry or the farmers, people who have to abandon their local areas to come to Port-au-Prince. And those that are funding the gangs, as Bob mentioned, the business leaders, people that are part of the ruling elite. So therefore, you have this class component, and in a way, those lower class, working class, and people in the slums, sometimes it feels as if that's how they are getting empowered by having that gun that they didn't have before, right? But one of the things about the interesting thing you mentioned about the provinces is that a lot of the traditional values still exist in the provinces in terms of things people think that they should do or they shouldn't do, despite the poverty and the challenges that they're facing. Even though during the last election that took place in 2016, there was a lot of money invested in arming young people in the provinces by politicians to force the results that they wanted. But afterward, there was still some restraining orders because they knew that if they were going to live in the community afterward, they had to be careful about what they did. But the other factor we haven't mentioned here is the drug trade. We know that Haiti is the center of drug trafficking for the Caribbean and other parts of the United States. So therefore, a lot of those gang leaders have become drug kingpins, and they're the ones who manage the traffic between Haiti and other parts. So therefore, the international actor is very important. What role are they going to play in this process? Whenever I'm talking, I'm always like to give examples because I've seen this, I've lived it. I remember when Préval became president, Southcom came to them and said, oh, we have to take care of the drug trafficking. And they handed Préval a map of all the small planes that are landing in Haiti at night, anywhere, because Haiti doesn't control its own airspace. It doesn't have any authority over the airspace. And then Préval said to the general, listen, you're presenting me that map, so you know everybody's coming in there. I give you guys authority to stop them. So, and Préval always was very practical about that. You come in, you want me to solve a problem, you solve it because you have the solution already. So therefore, how do there has to be some international collusion and intentional. The intent by the international community to stop the drug trafficking, to also the UN took a series of sanctions against many of the business leaders and politicians, but there has not been any enforcement of those sanctions. During the IGL 2 years ago, those sanctions were taken by the UN. So there hasn't been any. So therefore, if you don't send a signal that you mean business and you are really intentional about curbing and controlling the gangs, so they think it's they can do whatever they want. So definitely, I think, but I'm hopeful in the sense that the population in general, is tired of this violence. It's tired of this all displacement that has taken place and the undermining of the fabric of Haitian society. They will be supportive of any solution. That means, where they see really they're going after the gang leaders and the supporters and the business community and the politicians that support them. So I think it's possible to engage in a real dialogue along with the economic incentives that people can find other things to do besides just taking a gun and go kill others.
I think we're going to begin to wrap up as we don't have too much more time, but Robert, I wanted to see if you had some points to add, and then maybe we'll just take some concluding comments. Obviously, I think this is a conversation worth continuing, many more issues to explore, but that we've opened up a lot of important questions.
Yeah, well, for instance, you have some clear popular resistance to the gangs in Port-au-Prince, the whole Bois Calais movement. However imperfect it might be, because there is obviously problems with popular justice, but nonetheless, I think it has to some extent prevented the advance of the gangs in certain areas of Port-au-Prince and further up in Pétionville, etc. So there is already a popular resistance to the gangs. How to mobilize that is a very important question. Now, the international issue, we all know that most of the weapons comes either from Miami or from Colombia. And actually, in the last 2 days, the president of Colombia, said very publicly that a significant amount of weapons were stolen from the Colombian army and were probably shipped to Haiti in illegal trafficking of weapons. So that has to stop. It's very clear that Haiti doesn't have the means to do that, and that there are interests which are actually working, so they don't have that capacity. But that's an important issue for the international community to consider. Similarly, with the United States, what do you do in terms of stopping the illegal trafficking of weapons into Haiti? The final thing is that I believe also that negotiations are inevitable. They will happen, because you can't resolve this problem without negotiations. And we do know that negotiations are ongoing, not the type of negotiations that we may like, because they're essentially negotiations over, for instance, opening the arteries of Port-au-Prince to the oil depots in Vareux. And that means that you have to talk to Jimmy Cherizier, and that you have to give him money. So the negotiations are there. Similarly, in the ports, the private ports, there are negotiations with gangs. But one of the issues is that you need to change the substance of the negotiations, and you need also to change the substance of the interest of the people who are negotiating, because it's not just the gangs, it's also those private interests and those political interests. So this requires a massive amount of work. And as I've said, if you have finally some sort of presidential council that can reestablish a modicum of security and may set up a commission for reconciliation, then the negotiations, I think, will inevitably come about, because you cannot resolve that problem without talking to the gangs, whether you like it or not, whether those negotiations are in secret or delegated to other bodies or other people. But this is an imperative, and it's something that is inevitably going to happen.
Thank you. Well, I feel like we've put out a lot of questions, some routes for finding answers, if not answers. And I think established also that it would be great to continue this dialogue, perhaps with others, and to find the ways to draw on the experience that Mark and Martha, you have brought, and continue this dialogue. So are there any final words that maybe from Mark or Martha you want to add before we close?
I'm happy to leave it to our colleagues Robert and Francois, just to maybe echo what you said. I mean, I think this conversation is going to need to happen, and I would maybe my final comment in that sense would be, the sooner the conversation begins among people who I suppose bring the realism, the kind of realism that Robert and Francois have, the experience, I think the better. This issue is coming, and it could come sooner than we expect. The opportunity could come sooner than we expect. And so it's going to need people like Robert, François, and others who have that realism, have that experience to provide this critical early thinking and strategic leadership.
Thank you. Well, good. I think we all agree we'd like to talk more. So, but thank you so much, Maria. I'm going to hand it back to you to close us out. Really grateful for all of you for your all of the work that you do and for your knowledge and sharing that with our audience today.
So thank you, Laurent. And I would just want to thank our panelists for their contributions and insights on this very important conversation. And thank again the Karsh Institute for Democracy for joining IFID in this webinar. And I think that with this being said, we can bring the webinar to an end, and we will surely continue this conversation by other means.